February 9th, 1945, 04:17 hours, 120 feet beneath the surface of the Norwegian Sea. The war in Europe is grinding toward its bloody conclusion, but down here in the crushing darkness, there is no news, no politics, and no sunlight. There is only the pressure of the water and the hiss of static in a pair of headphones. Inside the steel hull of HMS Venturer, Lieutenant Jimmy Launders stands in the control room, listening to a sound that physics says should not exist. Through the hydrophones, the underwater ears of his vessel, he hears the rhythmic mechanical thrum of a diesel engine. It is a heavy industrial noise, the sound of pistons firing and crankshafts turning. In any other context, this would be the sound of a surface ship, a trawler or a destroyer, churning through the waves above. But Launders knows the ocean and he knows his instruments. The sound is not coming from above, it is coming from the same depth as his own ship. Somewhere in the black water ahead of him, another submarine is running its diesel engines while completely submerged. This acoustic anomaly represents the first crack in the established laws of naval warfare. For 40 years since the first practical submarines entered service, the rules of engagement had been rigid and binary. Submarines hunted surface ships, destroyers and aircraft hunted submarines. Submarine-on-submarine combat was a rare, chaotic event that only occurred on the surface, usually involving deck guns and ramming. But the idea of one submerged submarine hunting another submerged submarine was considered a tactical impossibility. It was a scenario that naval academies dismissed as science fiction. The technology simply did not exist. There were no guided torpedoes. There were no computers to calculate the complex three-dimensional trigonometry of a firing solution on a moving, invisible target. To fight underwater was to fight blind, deaf, and dumb. Yet, as Launders adjusts the gain on the receiver, the impossible sound grows louder. He is not listening to a ghost. He is listening to a German U-boat. And for the first time in history, the hunter has decided to enter the sanctuary of the prey. To understand the magnitude of the decision Launders is about to make, one must understand the myth of invulnerability that protected submariners during the Second World War. The ocean is a medium of secrets. Light does not penetrate more than a few hundred feet. Radar, the great eye of the surface war, bounces off the water. Once a submarine slips beneath the waves, it vanishes from the known world. For the crews of the U-boats and the Allied submarines, the depths were a place of safety. When attacked by surface ships, the standard procedure was to dive deep. The deeper you went, the harder it was for the enemy to find you with active sonar, and the harder it was for their depth charges to reach you. The underwater domain was a shield. The assumption was that if you couldn't see the enemy, you couldn't kill him. And since two submerged submarines are effectively blind to each other, they would pass in the night like two men walking in a pitch-black warehouse. They might sense each other's presence, but they could not aim a weapon. This belief shaped the design of every submarine built before 1945. They were armed with straight-running torpedoes, unguided projectiles that traveled on a gyro-stabilized course at a fixed depth. To hit a target, the captain had to know exactly where the enemy was, where he was going, and how fast he was moving. He had to solve a geometry problem involving two moving objects on a two-dimensional plane, the surface of the sea. But Launders is facing a three-dimensional problem. His target can turn left or right, but it can also dive or climb. The variables are exponential. A single degree of error in the calculation means the torpedo will pass harmlessly over or under the target. Launders, however, is not a typical submarine commander. He is 25 years old, a young man with a mind that works like a slide rule. While other captains are aggressive brawlers, Launders is a technician, a specialist in the arcane science of fire control. He does not rely on intuition, he relies on math. He believes that if you can hear it, you can track it. And if you can track it, you can kill it. The instrument of his will is HMS Venturer. She is a V-class submarine, small, agile, and relatively quiet. She is not the most powerful boat in the Royal Navy, but she is fitted with sensitive hydrophones, and crucially, she carries the Mark 8 torpedo. This weapon is old, reliable, and fast, but it is dumb. It has no homing head. It goes where it is told. The target Launders is stalking is a different beast entirely. It is U-864. The German boat is a Type D2, a massive, long-range cruiser submarine designed to travel to the ends of the Earth. She is nearly 300 feet long, displacing 1,800 tons, more than twice the size of the Venturer. She is a leviathan built to carry heavy cargo and survive the brutal storms of the Atlantic. But on this February morning, U-864 has a fatal flaw. She is loud. The noise that Launders hears, the impossible diesel thrum, is the result of a desperate German innovation known as the Snorkel, or Snorkel. By 1945, the Allied air supremacy over the Atlantic was total. German U-boats could no longer surface to recharge their batteries without being spotted by radar-equipped patrol planes and destroyed. The surface had become a death zone. To survive, German engineers developed the Snorkel, a retractable mast that allowed the submarine to draw in air for the diesel engines while remaining at periscope depth. It was a lifeline. It allowed the U-boats to travel continuously submerged, breathing through a straw. But the Snorkel was an imperfect technology. It forced the submarine to run its noisy diesel engines underwater. The hull, which usually dampened the sound of the electric motors, acted as a sounding board for the diesels. The vibration traveled through the water for miles. To a passive sonar operator, a snorkeling U-boat sounded like a freight train. This is the sound that Petty Officer Arthur Westcott, Venturer's sonar operator, picked up 40 minutes ago. Westcott is the other half of the equation. If Launders is the brain, Westcott is the ear. He sits in the cramped sonar shack, eyes closed, translating the chaotic noise of the ocean into tactical data. "He's starting and stopping, sir," Westcott reports. "The engine noise cuts out, then comes back." This intermittent signal tells a story. The Snorkel has a ball valve at the top to prevent water from pouring into the engine if a wave washes over the mast. In the rough seas of the Norwegian winter, the valve is slamming shut repeatedly. Every time it closes, the massive diesel engines instantly suck the air out of the submarine's interior, creating a painful vacuum that pops the crew's ears and starves them of oxygen until the valve opens again. The German crew is suffering. They are deafened by their own engines and blinded by the spray on their periscope. They have no idea that 4 miles away, a British submarine is running on silent electric motors, creeping into their acoustic blind spot. Launders studies the chart table. He marks the bearing, 0420 hours. The target is moving south. The location is critical. They are patrolling off the island of Fedje on the Norwegian coast. This is a choke point, a narrow corridor of deep water that serves as the highway for German submarines leaving the pens at Bergen. British intelligence, the code breakers at Bletchley Park, had warned the Admiralty that a special U-boat was trying to break out. They didn't know the exact route, but they knew the destination, Japan. Operation Caesar. That was the code name for U-864's mission. The boat is not on a standard war patrol. She is a blockade runner, a transport ship made of steel and armed with torpedoes. Her cargo holds are packed with the last hope of the Third Reich. She is carrying blueprints, prototypes, and specialized personnel. The stakes of this encounter are far higher than a simple tonnage war. If U-864 escapes, she will deliver advanced jet engine technology and missile guidance systems to the Japanese Empire. The war in the Pacific, currently grinding toward a bloody climax, could be prolonged by months or years. Launders doesn't know the specific details of the cargo, but he knows the target is high value. He has been ordered to intercept, but interception is not destruction. Finding the U-boat is only the first step. The problem remains, how to hit it. Standard procedure would be to surface and use the deck gun, or to fire a spread of torpedoes based on a visual sighting. But Launders cannot surface. The German boat is submerged. If Venturer surfaces, she will be blind to the underwater target. If she uses active sonar, the famous ping, the German captain will hear it instantly. He will dive deep, turn hard, and disappear into the acoustic clutter of the rocky coast. Launders has to stay submerged, he has to stay silent, and he has to shoot based on sound alone. He orders the Venturer to parallel the target's course. He is matching speed, keeping his distance. He is beginning a process that will take hours. He needs to build a mental model of the enemy's behavior. He needs to know how fast they are going, how often they zigzag, and most importantly, how deep they are. The depth is the hardest variable. Passive sonar gives bearing, but it gives very little information about depth. Is U-864 at 60 feet, 80 feet, 100? If Launders sets his torpedoes to run at 60 feet and the German is at 80, the weapons will pass harmlessly overhead. The myth of invulnerability says that you cannot solve this problem. It says that there are too many unknowns. It says that a submarine commander who fires torpedoes at a submerged target is wasting ammunition. But Launders is looking at the problem through the lens of a mathematician. He knows that the German captain, Ralph Reimar Wolfram, is human. He is following a doctrine. He is likely maintaining a steady depth to keep his snorkel efficient. He is likely zigzagging in a predictable pattern to search for surface threats. If Launders can find the pattern, he can predict the future. He stands in the center of the control room, the red lighting casting long shadows across the gauges. The air is cold, the breath of the crew misting in the gloom. The silence is absolute, save for the whisper of the hydroplanes and the scratch of Launders' pencil on the plot. He is drawing lines. He is calculating vectors. He is playing a game of three-dimensional chess against an opponent who doesn't even know the game has started. The impossible hunt is underway. The sanctuary of the deep has been violated. For the first time, a submarine is not a safe haven from the war. It is the battlefield. As the minutes tick by, the Venturer creeps closer. The sound of the German diesels grows louder, a mechanical heartbeat that guides the British boat through the dark. Launders is patient. He knows he has to wait for the perfect moment. He has to wait until the math is perfect. Because in this new kind of war, you don't get a second shot. If he misses, the German will hear the torpedoes, he will dive, he will turn, and then the hunter will become the hunted. U-864 is larger and has more firepower. If she turns her tubes on Venturer, the British boat will be outgunned, so Launders waits. He listens, he calculates. Outside the hull, the Norwegian Sea is black and indifferent. It hides the 2 steel cylinders moving through its depths. It hides the 61 men on the German boat and the 37 men on the British boat. It hides the history that is about to be written. The myth is about to die. The era of the underwater dogfight is about to begin, and it begins with a sound that shouldn't exist, echoing through the headphones of a man who refuses to believe in the impossible. To understand why a British submarine commander would risk firing blindly into the dark, one must first understand what was moving through that darkness. HMS Venturer was not hunting a standard patrol boat. She was hunting a desperate gamble by a dying empire to prolong a world war. The target, U-864, was not merely a warship. She was a specialized transport vessel, a blockade runner loaded with the technological seeds of a future war. In the winter of 1944, the Third Reich was collapsing. The Red Army was pushing from the east and the Allies were closing in from the west. But in the Pacific, the Empire of Japan was still fighting with a fanatical resolve. The strategic logic in Berlin was cold and transactional. If Germany could help Japan bleed the Americans in the Pacific, it might buy the Reich time to stabilize the European front, or at least negotiate a conditional surrender. This logic birthed Operation Caesar. The mission was to send a massive Type Ing D2 U-boat from Germany to Japan, navigating through the Allied blockade of the North Sea, down the length of the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and across the Indian Ocean. It was a voyage of more than 13,000 miles through waters completely dominated by the enemy. The cargo manifests of U-864, recovered from archives after the war, read like a shopping list for the apocalypse. Inside the pressure hull, crammed into every available space between the torpedoes and the bunks, were crates containing the blueprints and components for the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Japan was desperate for this technology. Their own aviation industry was struggling to catch up to the American B-29s bombarding their cities. If the Japanese could mass-produce jet fighters using German designs, they could regain air superiority over the home islands. Alongside the jet engines were the guidance systems for the V-2 rocket, the ballistic missile that was currently terrorizing London. Japan had its own missile program, but it lacked the sophisticated gyroscopes and accelerometers that German engineers had perfected. But the deadliest part of the cargo was not technology, it was raw material. Stowed in the keel, acting as ballast, were 1,857 steel flasks. Inside them was 67 tons of liquid mercury. Mercury is a vital component in the manufacture of high explosives, specifically fulminate of mercury used in primers and detonators. 67 tons was a staggering amount, enough to fuel the Japanese munitions industry for a year of total war. U-864 was also carrying human cargo. 2 German engineers, Messerschmitt specialists, and 2 Japanese naval architects were on board. These men were the intellectual capital required to turn the blueprints into weapons. The commander entrusted with this mission was Corvette Captain Ralph Reimar Wolfram. He was a veteran, a man who had survived the happy time of the U-boat war and lived long enough to see the tide turn against him. He knew that the Atlantic in 1945 was a very different place than it had been in 1940. It was no longer a hunting ground. It was a killing field monitored by radar-equipped Liberator bombers and hunter-killer groups of destroyers. Wolfram's strategy was simple: stay underwater. If he surfaced, he would be spotted. If he was spotted, he would be sunk. The cargo was too valuable to risk in a surface engagement. To achieve this constant submersion, U-864 relied on a piece of technology that was both a miracle and a curse: the Snorkel. The Snorkel was a folding mast similar to a periscope that could be raised above the surface while the submarine remained at a depth of roughly 50 feet. The mast contained 2 valves, an intake to suck fresh air down into the boat, and an exhaust to vent the fumes of the diesel engines. Before the Snorkel, a submarine had to surface to run its diesels and recharge its batteries. This made them vulnerable. With the Snorkel, a U-boat could recharge while submerged, exposing only a head the size of a bucket to the enemy radar. But for the crew of U-864, the Snorkel transformed the submarine into a torture chamber. When the diesel engines were running at periscope depth, they consumed massive amounts of air. The Snorkel sucked this air down through the mast with a deafening roar. The entire boat vibrated with the power of the engines. The air pressure inside the hull fluctuated wildly. The fatal flaw of the system was the head valve. To prevent water from pouring down the pipe and flooding the engines, the Snorkel was equipped with a float valve that slammed shut automatically if a wave washed over the mast. In the rough winter seas off Norway, the waves were constant. The valve would slam shut every few minutes. When the valve closed, the diesel engines did not stop immediately. They continued to suck air, but with the supply from the surface cut off, they sucked the air from inside the submarine itself. In seconds, the atmospheric pressure inside the hull would drop by 20%. It was like being inside a giant vacuum cleaner. The crew's ears would pop painfully. Their eyes would bulge. The sudden drop in pressure could rupture eardrums and cause capillaries in the nose to burst. Men would gasp, clutching their chests as the oxygen was ripped out of their lungs by the engines. Then, as the wave passed and the valve reopened, fresh air would slam back into the boat. The pressure would spike. The roar would return. This cycle of vacuum and overpressure, the Snorkel pumping, was physically exhausting and psychologically shattering. It left the crew dazed, suffering from headaches and chronic fatigue. It made sleep impossible, but the greatest danger of the Snorkel was not what it did to the crew, it was what it did to the boat's stealth. A submarine running on electric batteries is quiet. A submarine running on massive manned diesel engines is not. The noise of the combustion, the pistons hammering, and the exhaust venting into the water created an acoustic signature that was deafening. Crucially, the noise of the Snorkel blinded the U-boat's own sensors. The roar of the diesels and the rush of air drowned out the passive sonar array. While snorkeling, U-864 was effectively deaf. Wolfram could not hear an enemy approaching. He was relying entirely on his periscope watch to spot a ship or a plane visually in the brief moments between waves. Wolfram knew he was making noise, but he had to recharge the batteries. The electric motors needed power to navigate the long transit. He was trading silence for energy, gambling that the rough seas and the remote location would hide him. He did not know that his schedule had already been betrayed by bad luck. Operation Caesar had begun poorly. U-864 had departed Kiel in December 1944, but while transiting the Kiel Canal, she had run aground. The hull was damaged. She had to be towed to dry dock for repairs. Then, while transiting to Norway, she had developed a Snorkel malfunction. Wolfram had to put into Bergen for further repairs. These delays were fatal. They kept U-864 in European waters weeks longer than planned. They allowed British intelligence to pick up the radio traffic associated with the mission. And they placed the submarine off the coast of Fiji on exactly the day that Jimmy Launders and the HMS Venturer were patrolling that specific sector. On February 9th, U-864 was leaving Bergen for the final time. She was escorted by a German minesweeper, but once she reached deep water, the escort turned back. Wolfram was alone. He was running on his diesels, snorkeling, trying to push south as fast as possible to clear the dangerous coastal waters. His engines were suffering. One of them was misfiring, creating a distinct, irregular rhythm, chug, chug, clank, chug. This mechanical irregularity was the specific sound that traveled 4 miles through the water to the hydrophones of the Venturer. It was a sonic fingerprint. To a trained ear like Launders, it didn't just sound like a diesel, it sounded like a problem. Inside U-864, the atmosphere was tense. The crew knew they were carrying a dangerous cargo. The flasks of mercury were heavy, affecting the trim of the boat. If the canisters ruptured during a depth charge attack, the mercury would leak into the bilge, corroding the aluminum fittings and releasing toxic vapors. They were sailing on a poison pill. Wolfram ordered the Snorkel secured for a routine hydrophone check. The diesels shut down, the valve closed. The silence returned to the boat. The sonar operator on U-864 listened. He heard the distant noise of fishing boats. He heard the waves, but he did not hear the Venturer. The British submarine was running on her electric motors, creeping at 2 knots. She was quiet. Wolfram, satisfied that the area was clear, ordered the Snorkel raised again. The diesels roared back to life. The U-864 resumed her noisy, blind passage south. This decision, the necessity of energy over stealth, sealed the fate of the mission. Wolfram was following standard doctrine. He was doing exactly what he was trained to do: conserve battery power for the open ocean. He could not imagine that a British submarine was tracking him, plotting his course, and preparing to fire torpedoes based solely on the sound of his exhaust. He believed his enemy was in the sky. He was looking up, watching for the shadow of a Liberator bomber. He did not look down. As the U-864 plowed through the swell, the jet engines in her hold vibrated with the hull. These machines were the future of warfare, capable of speeds that could outrun any Allied plane. But they were trapped inside a machine from the past, a diesel boat struggling to breathe in a world that belonged to the hunters. The strategic irony was profound. Germany was sending its most advanced technology to Japan in a vessel that was rendered obsolete by the very nature of its propulsion. The Snorkel was a desperate patch, a way to keep old submarines fighting in a new war, but it was a patch that leaked noise. 4 miles away, on the Venturer, Jimmy Launders was doing the math. He was calculating the speed of the German boat based on the RPM of the propeller cavitation he could hear through the interference. He was estimating the range based on the volume of the diesel thrum. Operation Caesar was about to collide with Operation Intercept. The cargo would never reach Japan. The Mercury would never fill a shell casing. The jet engines would never fly. The target was moving south, heavy and loud, unaware that it had already been acquired. The impossible engagement had moved past the phase of detection and entered the phase of stalking. Wolfram checked his watch. He planned to snorkel for another hour, then dive deep to rest the crew. He just needed 60 more minutes of air. He wouldn't get them. In the lexicon of naval heroes, there are the aggressive brawlers like Nelson and the strategic visionaries like Nimitz. But Lieutenant James Jimmy Launders belonged to a different, rarer archetype, the warrior scholar. Standing in the control room of HMS Venturer, illuminated by the harsh glow of the red tactical lights, Launders did not look like a man about to commit an act of violence. He looked like a man trying to solve a particularly difficult equation. Launders was 25 years old, but his reputation in the Royal Navy Submarine Service was already established. He was known as the Professor. While other officers spent their shore leave in the pubs of Scotland, Launders was known to spend his time studying navigation charts and fire control tables. He possessed a mind that saw the world in vectors and probabilities. To him, a torpedo attack was not a roll of the dice. It was a geometry problem with a correct answer. On this morning in February 1945, that answer was hiding somewhere in a volume of water measuring cubic miles. The hunt for U-864 was not a quick ambush. It was a slow-motion stalk that lasted for hours. The initial detection of the diesel noise had given Launders a bearing, but a bearing is just a line on a map. It tells you direction, not distance. The German submarine could be 2 miles away, or it could be 10. To find the range without using an active sonar ping, which would instantly alert the Germans, Launders had to use a technique known as target motion analysis, TMA. This involves moving the Venturer along a specific course, listening to the bearing of the target change, and then altering course to listen again. By plotting the intersection of these bearing lines over time, a skilled navigator can triangulate the position of the enemy, but this requires the enemy to cooperate. If the target changes speed or course while you are measuring him, the math falls apart. The solution becomes a jagged mess of contradictory lines, and U-864 was not cooperating. The German captain, Ralph Reimar Wolfram, was following standard anti-submarine doctrine. He was zigzagging. Every few minutes, U-864 would alter its heading by 20 or 30 degrees. This maneuver was designed to throw off the aim of a submarine firing from a static position. To a predator trying to predict where the prey would be in 10 minutes, the zigzag was a nightmare. Inside the sonar shack, Petty Officer Arthur Westcott was performing a feat of acoustic endurance. He sat hunched over the receiver, eyes closed, his entire world reduced to the information coming through his headphones. He was filtering out the background noise of the Norwegian Sea, the crashing of the waves on the surface, the groaning of the ice, to lock onto the mechanical rhythm of the German engine. "Target bearing shifting right, sir. Engine pitch steady. He's turning again." Launders stood at the plotting table, a pencil in his hand. He was building a mental model of the German captain's mind. He realized that Wolfram's zigzags were not random. They were procedural. The German captain was likely running a box search or a standard transit weave. He would run south-southwest for 10 minutes, then turn south-southeast for 10 minutes. Launders began to anticipate the turns. He stopped reacting to the data and started predicting it. "He's going to come back to 010 in 3 minutes," Launders whispered to his first lieutenant. 3 minutes later, Westcott reported, "Target bearing shifting left, he's coming back." The crew of the Venturer watched their captain with a mixture of awe and anxiety. They knew what he was doing. He was hunting a submarine that he couldn't see, based on sounds that were barely audible, in an area of the ocean that was treacherous with rocks and currents. They also knew that Venturer was running on battery power. Every hour of the hunt drained the energy they would need to escape if the tables turned. The stalk was a physical ordeal. To keep the Venturer's own noise to a minimum, the air conditioning was off. The heat from the electrical systems built up inside the hull. The air grew stale, heavy with the smell of sweat and ozone. The crew moved in socks, communicating in whispers. A dropped wrench, a slammed hatch, or a loud voice could transmit through the hull and alert the Germans. Then the game changed. Through the headphones, the rhythmic thrumming of the German diesel engine suddenly stopped. "Target has shut down diesels," Westcott reported. "Sound source gone." U-864 had finished its battery charge. Wolfram had lowered the snorkel mast, shut off the noisy man engines, and switched to his electric motors. In an instant, the German submarine went from being a freight train to being a ghost. The acoustic signature dropped from a roar to a whisper. On the passive sonar display, the contact vanished. The control room of the Venturer went silent. The lifeline was cut. They were blind. This was the moment where most submarine commanders would have broken off the attack. You cannot hunt what you cannot hear. The ocean is too big. If U-864 decided to dive deep and sprint away, or if she turned back toward the coast, Venturer would never find her again. But Launders did not turn away. He looked at the plot. He looked at the pencil lines marking the German's previous course. "He hasn't gone away," Launders said. "He's just gone quiet. He's still moving south. He thinks he's safe." Launders bet his ship on the psychology of his opponent. He reasoned that Wolfram, believing he was undetected, would not make a radical course change. He would likely continue his transit to the northwest, saving his batteries, moving slowly and steadily. Launders ordered the Venturer to continue on the intercept course. He was navigating based on a ghost track, steering toward a point in the empty ocean where he calculated the German submarine should be. It was a game of dead reckoning played with nuclear stakes. Launders had to calculate his own speed, the drift of the current, and the estimated speed of the silent German boat. If he guessed wrong on the German speed by even 1 knot, the two submarines would miss each other by miles. For 45 minutes, the Venturer crept through the darkness. The sonar operators strained their ears, turning the gain up until the static of the ocean roared like a waterfall, looking for the faint whine of the German electric motors. Nothing. The doubt began to creep in. Had Wolfram turned? Had he stopped? Was he right now sitting on the bottom, listening to the Venturer approach? Then a noise. It was faint, a metallic clank followed by a whirring sound. It was the sound of a periscope motor or a hydroplane linkage. It was a transient, a short mechanical noise made by a crewman or a machine. Contact, bearing 090, close! Launders had guessed right. The U-864 was right where the math said she would be. In fact, she was closer than they thought. The German submarine had drifted across the Venturer's bow. The hunters were now in the same patch of water. The range was closing to less than 3,000 yards. But detecting the enemy was only half the problem. Launders now had to figure out how to shoot him. The Mark E-8 torpedo was a dumb weapon. Once fired, it ran in a straight line at a fixed depth. To hit a surface ship, you aimed where the ship was going to be. But a surface ship is trapped on the 2D plane of the water. A submarine operates in 3D. Launders had to determine the depth of the U-864. This was the variable that terrified the fire control team. Passive sonar is notoriously bad at determining depth. There is no simple readout. You have to infer depth from the acoustic environment. Launders knew that U-864 had been snorkeling earlier. That meant she had been at periscope depth, roughly 60 feet. Now that she was on electric motors, had she gone deep? Launders reasoned that Wolfram was still in transit mode. He was likely staying near periscope depth to take navigational fixes or to raise the snorkel again quickly if needed. He wasn't evading, he was traveling. Assume target depth 60 to 80 feet, Launders ordered. It was an educated guess, a wager made with the lives of his crew. If Wolfram was at 200 feet, the torpedoes would pass harmlessly over his head. Launders moved to the periscope. He couldn't use it to see the target. The German was submerged, but he raised it briefly, just above the surface, to get a final check on his own position relative to the Fiji Island lighthouse. He needed a perfect fix to ensure his own movement wasn't throwing off the calculations. He lowered the scope. The stage was set. But then the U-864 did something unexpected. Westcott reported a sudden change in the acoustic signature. Target is altering course, hard to starboard. And I hear the diesel's starting. He's raising the snorkel. Wolfram had made a fatal mistake. Perhaps his batteries were lower than he thought, or perhaps he felt safe enough to top them off. He had decided to snorkel again. The roar of the German diesels flooded the Venturer's sensors. The acoustic picture sharpened instantly. The intermittent, agonizingly faint contact became a solid wall of noise. The German captain had just handed Launders his location on a silver platter, but he had also introduced a new variable. The U-864 was zigzagging again. The target was weaving back and forth. Launders realized he couldn't fire a single torpedo. The chances of a miss were too high. The zigzag meant the German's future position was a probability cloud, not a single point. To kill the U-864, Launders would have to cover the cloud. He would have to fire a spread, a fan of torpedoes timed to arrive at different points along the enemy's projected track. He pulled out his notebook. He looked at the stopwatch. He began to do the math that no computer existed to solve. Time of flight, enemy speed, enemy zigzag period, torpedo spread angle. He was calculating a firing solution with 4 variables in his head, in the dark, while commanding a submarine that was running out of battery. The crew watched him. They saw the intensity in his eyes. They saw the professor at work. They didn't know if it was possible to hit a submerged submarine. The manual said it wasn't. The history books said it had never been done. But looking at Launders, they began to believe. Standby torpedoes 1 through 4, Launders said. His voice was calm, conversational. Set running depth. Varies, 2 at 60 feet, 2 at 80 feet. He was bracketing the depth. He was covering his bet. The tube doors opened. The sea rushed into the firing chambers. The Venturer was ready. The mathematician had solved the equation. Now he just had to prove his work. The time was 12:11. The hunt had lasted nearly 4 hours. The waiting was over. Fire 1. The submarine shuddered as the first torpedo was ejected by a blast of compressed air. The weapon's motor whined as it spun up, accelerating toward the target. Launders waited. He watched the second hand on his watch sweep. He wasn't firing a salvo, he was firing a sequence. He was painting a box of death in the water. 17.5 seconds. Fire 2, another shudder, another weapon away. 17.5 seconds. Fire 3. 15.5 seconds. Fire 4. The impossible shot was in the water. 4 Mark 8 torpedoes were speeding at 45 knots toward the unsuspecting German submarine. Launders lowered the stopwatch. There was nothing more he could do. The math had left his hands. Now it was up to the physics of the explosion. In the control room, the silence returned, heavier than before. They listened. They counted. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Then Westcott shouted from the sonar shack, "Torpedo running noises detected by the target. He's heard them." On the U-864, the sound of the incoming torpedoes had finally cut through the roar of the diesels. Wolfram knew he was under attack. He knew death was seconds away. And in that final moment, the German captain made a decision that would determine the outcome of the battle. He reacted to the sound. He tried to save his ship, but Launders had anticipated the reaction. The trap was not where the German was. It was where the German was going to be. The mathematician had checkmated the warrior, and the ocean was about to claim its prize. To the modern mind, accustomed to digital precision and automated targeting, the act of firing a torpedo in 1945 seems less like a science and more like a gamble. But inside the control room of the HMS Venturer, Lieutenant Jimmy Launders was not gambling. He was engaged in a feat of mental calculation that bordered on the preternatural. He had no fire control computer. The standard British fruit machine, a mechanical calculator used to solve torpedo triangles, was designed for surface attacks. It could handle bearing, speed, and range. It could not handle depth, nor could it easily account for a target that was zigzagging in 3 dimensions. Launders had to build a computer out of paper, pencil, and his own brain. The paper computer was not a metaphor. Launders stood at the chart table, surrounded by his navigation team. He plotted the known positions of the U-864 based on the acoustic intercepts. He marked the time of each turn. He drew lines representing the Germans' probable course. He was building a predictive model of the future. The variables he had to juggle were staggering. First, there was the target speed. Launders estimated the German boat was making roughly 3 to 4 knots while silent, and slightly faster while snorkeling. But this was an estimate based on the sound of the propeller blades. If he was wrong by even half a knot, the torpedo would miss by hundreds of yards over a long run. Second, there was the range. Passive sonar does not give range directly. Launders had to deduce it from the strength of the signal and the geometry of the bearing change. He estimated the distance at roughly 2,700 yards. Third, there was the zigzag. The U-864 was weaving back and forth. Launders had timed the turns. He knew that Wolfram was likely following a standard Kriegsmarine evasion pattern. He calculated that the German boat would turn back to a southerly course in exactly 4 minutes. Fourth, and most critically, there was the depth. The acoustic data suggested the German was at periscope depth, roughly 60 feet. But if Wolfram heard the torpedoes and decided to dive, he could drop to 300 feet in less than a minute. Launders realized that he could not fire a single torpedo. A single shot requires a perfect solution, and there were too many unknowns. He needed to fire a spread. A spread is a salvo of torpedoes fired at slightly different angles to cover a wider area. It is a shotgun blast rather than a rifle shot. But usually, a spread is horizontal, fan-shaped to catch a ship turning left or right. Launders needed a spread that covered time and depth. He decided to fire 4 torpedoes. He would not fire them all at once. If he did, the acoustic signature of 4 torpedoes starting simultaneously would be deafening. The German sonar operator would hear it instantly, giving Wolfram maximum warning time to evade. Instead, Launders chose a ripple fire technique. He would fire the torpedoes at intervals. This would confuse the German sonar picture. The first torpedo might sound like a biological noise or a distant ship. By the time the second and third were in the water, the first would be closing in. But what was the correct interval? Launders looked at his stopwatch. He needed the torpedoes to arrive at the target at roughly the same time, but from slightly different angles, catching the U-boat in a box of explosives. He calculated the run time. At 45 knots, the Mark 8 torpedo would cover the 2,700 yards in about 2 minutes. He decided on an interval of 17.5 seconds between shots. Why 17.5 seconds? It was a number derived from the reload speed of the tubes, the stability of the submarine, firing a heavy torpedo affects the trim, and the desire to space the weapons out along the Germans' projected track. The depth settings were the final piece of the puzzle. If he set all the torpedoes to 60 feet and the German dove, they would all miss. If he set them deep and the German stayed shallow, they would pass underneath. Launders decided to bracket the target. Set depth on torpedoes 1 and 2 to 60 feet, he ordered. Set depth on torpedoes 3 and 4 to 80 feet. He was betting that Wolfram, if he reacted, would dive. The deeper torpedoes were the killers. They were the safety net. The crew in the torpedo room received the orders. They used heavy wrenches to physically turn the depth-setting spindles on the torpedoes. It was manual labor, sweating work in a freezing steel tube. They checked the gyro angles. They opened the bow caps, flooding the tubes with the cold Norwegian Sea. Tubes 1 through 4 ready, the report came back. Launders looked at the chronometer. 12:12 p.m. The sun was high above the water, filtering down into the green gloom. The U-864 was still churning away, her snorkel raised, her captain unaware that he was the variable in a lethal equation. Launders took a breath. The math was done. The paper computer had generated its solution. Now he had to trust it. Fire 1. The boat lurched. The compressed air blast ejected the first torpedo. The sound of the weapon's propellers spinning up, a high-pitched whine, filled the sonar shack. 1 away. Launders watched the stopwatch. The second hand swept past the 12, past the 6. Fire 2. Another lurch, another whine. 2 away. The sequence continued. 17.5 seconds later, number 3, then number 4. 4 torpedoes were now racing through the water at 45 knots. They were dumb weapons, blind machines running on clockwork gyros. They could not change course. They could not hunt. They were simply following the lines that Launders had drawn on the chart. The paper computer had done its job. Now, the human drama began. On board U-864, the world was noisy. The diesels were roaring. The air was pulsing. The crew was tired. But in the sound room, the sonar operator heard something cutting through the mechanical din. It was a new sound, a high-speed screw noise. It was getting louder. Torpedo running. Bearing port beam. The shout galvanized the control room. Captain Wolfram reacted instantly. He did not hesitate. He did what every U-boat commander was trained to do when attacked from the surface. He assumed the attack was coming from a destroyer or an aircraft. He assumed the torpedoes were shallow-running weapons designed to hit a surface ship. His doctrine told him to dive, to get deep, to put water between his hull and the surface. Alarm! Emergency dive! Hard starboard! All ahead flank! The U-864 nosed down. The electric motors screamed as they took over from the diesels. The snorkel mast was retracted. The submarine angled steeply toward the bottom. Wolfram believed he was saving his ship. He was diving into the safety of the deep. He did not know that he was diving directly into the trap that Launders had set. The geometry of the engagement was closing. The torpedoes were running true. The first torpedo passed ahead of the U-864. The German had turned inside its turning circle. The second torpedo passed astern. Wolfram's maneuver was working. He was dodging the spread. He was getting deeper. 60 feet, 70 feet. But then came the third torpedo. It was set to run at 80 feet. The U-864, diving hard, passed through the 60-foot mark. She was heavy, accelerating downward. She crossed the 70-foot mark. At 12:14 p.m., the path of the submarine and the path of the torpedo intersected. The U-864 didn't just get hit, she ran into the weapon. The submarine effectively impaled herself on the torpedo's track. The collision point was amidships, near the control room. The warhead of the Mark U-8 torpedo contained 750 pounds of Torpex, an explosive 50% more powerful than TNT. The explosion was not a dull thud, it was a geological event. The shockwave hammered the Venturer. It shook the British submarine violently, knocking dust from the overheads and throwing men off balance. Hit! Explosion, Westcott shouted from the sonar shack. Then a second sound, a terrifying metallic groaning. The sound of heavy steel structures collapsing under immense pressure. The sound of bulkheads giving way. The sound of air escaping. It was the death rattle of U-864. The torpedo had broken the back of the German submarine. The pressure hull, compromised by the blast, imploded instantly. The sea rushed in, not as a flood, but as a solid piston of water. For the 61 men on board, the end was instantaneous. The control room was vaporized. The men in the forward and aft compartments were crushed by the pressure wave before they could even register that they had been hit. The U-864 broke into two pieces. The bow section and the stern section plummeted separately to the bottom of the trench, 500 feet down. On the Venturer, the silence returned. The high-speed whine of the torpedoes was gone. The thrum of the German diesel was gone. There was only the background hiss of the ocean and the settling of debris. Launders lowered the stopwatch. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He had done it. He had solved the problem. The paper computer had worked. The math had killed the machine. But there was no cheering in the control room. The crew of the Venturer knew exactly what had just happened. They knew the sound of a hull imploding because it was the sound of their own nightmares. They had just listened to 61 sailors die. Launders ordered the boat to surface. He needed to confirm the kill. He needed to see the debris. The Venturer rose to periscope depth. Launders looked through the optic. On the surface, there was a massive oil slick. It was spreading across the gray waves, iridescent and thick. In the center of the slick, debris was bobbing. Wood, cork, life jackets. There were no survivors. Launders cataloged the debris. He noted the position. Then he ordered the Venturer to clear the area. He knew that if there were other U-boats nearby or German surface patrols, the explosion would have alerted them. The hunter could easily become the hunted again. As the Venturer slipped away, leaving the oil slick behind, the magnitude of the achievement began to settle in. They had done the impossible. They had sunk a submerged submarine, but the victory was shadowed by the nature of the target. Launders did not know about the Mercury. He did not know about the jet engines. He only knew that he had destroyed a U-boat. He did not know that he had just created an environmental time bomb that would lie ticking on the ocean floor for 70 years. The paper computer had solved the firing solution, but it could not calculate the long-term cost. The Mercury flasks were tumbling into the mud, cracking open, spilling their toxic cargo into the ecosystem. The engagement was over. The legacy was just beginning. The mathematician had won the battle, but the war for the ocean floor was far from finished. The oil slick spreading across the surface of the Norwegian Sea was the only physical proof that a battle had taken place. There was no burning hull to photograph, no prisoners to interrogate, and no prize to tow back to port. As HMS Venturer turned her bow west, heading back toward the British base at Lerwick in the Shetland Islands, Lieutenant Jimmy Launders knew that he was returning with a story that strained the boundaries of credibility. In the rigid hierarchy of the Royal Navy, claims of impossible victories were viewed with skepticism. Submarine commanders were expected to be aggressive, but they were also expected to be precise. To claim that you had sunk a submerged U-boat while submerged yourself, using a pencil, a stopwatch, and a spread of unguided torpedoes, sounded less like a patrol report and more like a hallucination induced by diesel fumes and exhaustion. When Venturer docked, the crew was weary. They had been hunting for days in freezing conditions. Launders walked into the debriefing room at the flotilla headquarters carrying his logbook and his charts. He laid out the geometry of the engagement. He showed the senior officers the sound plots, the bearing changes, and the math. The initial reaction from the Admiralty was cautious. Acoustic intercepts were notoriously unreliable. Was it possible he had torpedoed a wreck, or a whale, or a thermal layer? The idea that a German captain would steer his boat directly into a torpedo spread seemed too perfect, a statistical anomaly. But the evidence began to mount. The sonar operators on the Venturer had recorded the distinct sounds of the hull breaking up, the crunch of implosion that is unmistakable to anyone who has heard it. The lookouts had seen the debris field, fresh wood, cork insulation, and oil that smelled of German diesel. However, the definitive confirmation did not come from the British side, it came from the Germans. In May 1945, the Third Reich surrendered. As Allied intelligence officers sifted through the captured archives of the Kriegsmarine, they found the radio logs for U-864. The submarine had reported her departure. She had reported her engine troubles. And then she had gone silent. The German records confirmed that U-864 was in the exact sector where Venturer had attacked at the exact time the torpedoes were fired. There were no other U-boats in the area. The correlation was absolute. The Royal Navy officially credited Launders with the kill. He was awarded a bar to his Distinguished Service Order, DSO. The citation was understated, praising his skill, daring, and judgment. It did not use the word impossible, but the implication was clear. Launders had rewritten the rulebook. But the true magnitude of the victory was only revealed when the nature of U-864's cargo was declassified. The British intelligence services had known Operation Caesar was important, but they hadn't known just how close the timeline was. The crates in the hold of U-864 contained the blueprints and components for the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe. This was the world's first operational jet fighter, a machine that could fly at 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the best American Mustang or Corsair. In Germany, the Me-262 had arrived too late to change the air war, but in the Pacific, the situation was different. Japan was preparing for the final defense of the home islands. They were building a massive fleet of suicide aircraft for the expected American invasion. Japan had its own jet program, the Nakajima Kikka, based on incomplete data sent earlier by U-boat. But the Japanese engineers were struggling with the metallurgy of the jet engines. The engines were failing. They couldn't withstand the heat. The cargo on U-864 contained the solution. It held the specific alloy formulas and the precision machine turbine blades that the Japanese needed to make their jets work. It also carried the German engineers who knew how to build them. If U-864 had reached Penang, and if that technology had been transferred to Tokyo, the skies over Japan in late 1945 might have looked very different. A squadron of reliable Japanese jet fighters could have wreaked havoc on the American B-29 bomber streams. They could have been used as supersonic kamikazes against the invasion fleet. The cargo also included guidance systems for the V-2 missile. Japan was not developing long-range ballistic missiles, but the guidance technology would have drastically improved the accuracy of their Oka suicide rocket planes. By sinking U-864, Jimmy Launders had not just destroyed a submarine, he had severed a technological lifeline. He had ensured that the skies over the Pacific remained under Allied control. It was a strategic victory won with 4 torpedoes in a remote Norwegian fjord. For Launders personally, the war ended quietly. He continued to serve in the Navy, eventually retiring as a commander. He was a modest man, the antithesis of the bragging ace. He rarely spoke about the engagement. When asked, he would often credit his sonar operator, Westcott, or simply say the math worked out. He died in 1988, never knowing that his duel would become the subject of intense study by naval historians and environmentalists alike. He went to his grave believing he had done a good job, but perhaps not realizing he had left a toxic legacy on the ocean floor. For decades, the wreck of U-864 was forgotten. It was just another coordinate on a map of thousands of ships sunk during the war. The Norwegian fishermen knew there was something down there. They snagged their nets on the debris occasionally, but the specific identity of the pile of steel was lost to the currents. The Cold War moved the focus of submarine warfare to the deep Atlantic and the Arctic. The tactics pioneered by Launders, passive tracking, predictive fire control, the use of the environment, became the standard doctrine of the nuclear age. Every commander of a Los Angeles-class or a Trafalgar-class submarine was unknowingly a student of Jimmy Launders. They trained to do exactly what he had done, hunt a submerged enemy using only sound and math. But while the tactics lived on, the physical reality of Operation Caesar lay dormant in the mud. The steel flasks of Mercury, 1,857 of them, were rusting. Mercury is a heavy metal. It is insidious. In its liquid form, it is fascinating to look at, but in the environment, it is a persistent neurotoxin. It does not degrade. It bioaccumulates. It moves from the sediment into the plankton, then into the crabs, then into the fish, and finally into the humans who eat the fish. The 67 tons of mercury aboard U-864 represented an environmental disaster waiting for a timeline. The steel canisters were made of wartime German steel, strong but not stainless. They were sitting in salt water. Corrosion was inevitable. In the late 1990s, the Royal Norwegian Navy began to review its charts. They were looking for hazards to pipelines and fishing. They re-examined the records of the war. They realized that U-864 was not just a war grave, it was a chemical weapon. The search for the wreck began in earnest. It was not a hunt for glory, but a hunt for poison. The quiet victory of 1945 had solved the problem of the Japanese jet fighters, but it had created a new problem for the future. Launders had stopped the Mercury from reaching Japan, but he had deposited it on the doorstep of Norway. As the 20th century closed, the story of U-864 shifted genres. It moved from a war thriller to an environmental horror story. The bravery of the crew and the brilliance of the calculation were overshadowed by the toxic reality of the cargo. The ocean had hidden the wreck for 50 years, but the chemistry was about to reveal it. The Mercury was leaking, the tomb was cracking open. The final chapter of the story would not be written by sailors, but by roboticists and politicians. The question was no longer how to sink the submarine, but how to save the ocean from the ship that had already been sunk. The impossible shot had echoed through history, but the echo was turning toxic. And the people of Fedje Island were about to find out that the war their grandparents watched from the cliffs was still fighting them from the bottom of the sea. In 2003, the Norwegian Navy's mine hunter HMS Venturer was conducting a routine survey of the seabed near Fedje, an island community known for its lighthouse and its fishing. The sonar operator watched the screen as the ship moved over a deep trench. The bottom was littered with the detritus of the North Sea, rocks, old nets, and the occasional shipwreck. But then the sonar painted something distinct. It was a massive steel cylinder, broken in two, lying in the mud at a depth of 150 meters. The shape was unmistakable. It was a Type D2 U-boat. They had found U-864. The discovery of the wreck solved a 60-year-old mystery, but it immediately created a 21st century crisis. The submarine was lying on a steep slope of unstable clay. The bow section and the stern section were separated by a debris field, and scattered among the twisted piping and the remains of the torpedo tubes were the steel flasks. The Norwegian Coastal Administration, Kystverket, launched an investigation. They sent remote-operated vehicles, ROVs, down to the site. The cameras revealed a scene of slow-motion decay. The pressure hull was corroded, the outer casing was gone, but the flasks were there. Some were intact, others were breached. The scientists took sediment samples. The results were terrifying. The concentration of mercury in the mud around the wreck was massive. The flasks were leaking. 67 tons of liquid mercury, a quantity sufficient to poison the entire North Sea ecosystem, was slowly bleeding into the environment. The toxic tomb had opened. For the people of Fedje, this was a catastrophe. Their economy, their culture, and their diet depended on the fish that swam in these waters. Now they were told that the fish might be toxic. The wreck of U-864 was designated a high-priority environmental hazard. The Norwegian government faced a dilemma that echoed the complexity of Launders' original problem. How do you deal with a dangerous object at the bottom of the sea without making it worse? There were two options. Option 1, raise the wreck. This was the preferred solution of the locals and environmental groups. They wanted the poison gone. They argued that leaving it there was a ticking time bomb. But the engineering challenges were immense. The hull was fragile. The sediment was unstable. If they tried to lift the submarine, it might break apart, spilling the remaining mercury into the water column in a massive, uncontrollable cloud. The flasks might rupture. The cure could be worse than the disease. Option 2, entomb the wreck. This involved covering the submarine and the surrounding seabed with a massive layer of sand and rocks, essentially building a sarcophagus on the ocean floor. This would seal the mercury in, preventing it from entering the food chain. It was safer, cheaper, and technically feasible, but it meant leaving the poison there forever. It meant trusting that the tomb would hold for thousands of years. The debate raged for years. Politicians argued, scientists modeled currents. The wreck sat there, leaking. Finally, the decision was made. The risks of raising the wreck were deemed too high. The Norwegian government decided to cap the site. They would bury U-864 under tons of specialized sand and gravel, sealing the tomb permanently. The operation was a massive undertaking, requiring precision dumping from surface ships. It was a strange echo of the depth charge attacks of 1945, dropping objects from the surface to neutralize a threat on the bottom. But this time, the goal was preservation, not destruction. As the sand rained down on the rusted hull, it covered the evidence of the battle. It buried the shattered control room where Wolfram had died. It buried the empty torpedo tubes, and it buried the Mercury. The story of HMS Venturer and U-864 is unique in the annals of warfare. It is the only time a submerged submarine sank another submerged submarine. It was a victory of intellect over brute force, of math over machine. But its legacy is complex. It is a story of how a brilliant tactical success can lead to a long-term environmental failure. Launders did his job. He stopped the technology from reaching Japan. He shortened the war, but in doing so, he created a hazard that his grandchildren would have to deal with. It reminds us that the consequences of war do not end when the peace treaty is signed. The steel remains, the chemicals remain, the ocean remembers. Today, the waters off Fedje are quiet. The lighthouse still sweeps the horizon. The fishing boats still go out. But beneath them, under a mound of clean sand, lies the last battleground of the technological war. The impossible shot changed the way navies thought about the deep. It proved that there is no sanctuary. It proved that if you make a sound, you can be found. And it proved that even in the darkest, coldest, most remote places on Earth, the war can reach you. Jimmy Launders and his crew are gone. The men of U-864 are gone. But the equation they solved that day, the interception of 2 lines in the dark, is still being taught. Every modern submarine commander knows the story. They know that somewhere in the silence, someone might be listening, counting their propeller turns, and checking a stopwatch. The myth of invulnerability is dead. The reality of the hunt remains, and in the silence of the Norwegian trench, the Mercury waits, a silver poison sleeping in a steel grave, a final, toxic reminder that in war, even the victories have a half-life. The engagement between HMS Venturer and U-864 stands as a testament to the power of the human mind under pressure. In an era before digital computers, Jimmy Launders turned his brain into a fire control system. He used logic to defeat technology. He used patience to defeat speed. It is a story that humanizes the machinery of war. We often focus on the torpedoes and the sonar sets, but the deciding factor was the intuition of a 25-year-old lieutenant who trusted his math more than his fears. But the environmental coda serves as a necessary grounding. It strips away the romance of the clean kill. There are no clean kills in industrial warfare. There is always debris. There is always a cost that is paid by the future. As we look back at this impossible shot, we should marvel at the skill, but we should also mourn the waste. The brilliance used to sink the submarine and the brilliance used to build the jet engines inside it were both consumed by the same conflict. The ocean covers the scars, but it does not heal them. It just hides them, waiting for us to find them again. If this deep dive into the hidden history of World War II and the science of submarine warfare meant something to you, we'd be honored to have you with us again. Until next time, stay curious and take good care.